Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me back there? Okay, good. Great. Welcome. Thank you very much for coming this evening. I think it'll be well worth your while. Just a couple of administrative things. Please turn off any of your devices, silence your devices. I am also instructed to say that if you need to use the restrooms, use the ones that are right here immediately around the lobby, not ones that are over there and are, I guess, for staff. So thank you for that. It's great to have you with us tonight. Yeah.
People who you are.
Who I am? I'm Larry Silverman. I'm program director for the Savannah Council on World Affairs. This is my agent, Corey, and please see him about any public things. I've also officiated at a wedding, so if people are interested in that, I can do that. But thank you all, and thanks to all the help that we get from all of our volunteers. We are an all-volunteer organization, and we appreciate all the services that people, our board and our committee chair people and staffs do. Let me just mention, as we always do, our sponsors for this evening. Our longtime sponsor, Kreitz, as you know, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Buick, and GMC, have been a very loyal and strong supporter of the council for, I don't know, Chip, how long?
10 years.
10 years? Yeah, more or less. So we're very, very appreciative for Kreitz's role in the community. For Planters Inn, who's a great host to our speakers all the time. It's a great place to stay in a great location downtown, and all of our guest speakers really enjoy the hospitality there. And a new sponsor for this year, you've heard about them before, Four Seasons Travel. They was a past sponsor as well. And they're being able to customize travel experiences for all of you, and they did it for me and helped save me on one trip that I did, offering some very good advice. And we have from Four Seasons Travel, Carolyn LaFleur, who can just stand up there for a moment. Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you for the support of Four Seasons Travel. I do want to mention, before I introduce our speaker tonight, and he's a great one, on March 19th, we will do a subject that we've been wanting to do for a long time because I think there's interest. It just says Africa there. I was just talking to somebody before we started here tonight about Africa. Just remember, it's 53 states, 53 countries or so. It's not just one continent. But the person that's going to be coming to speak, a former colleague of mine, has really been instrumental both in the State Department Foreign Service and then his second career life in promoting business between the United States and the various countries of Africa. And that includes subjects about natural resources, African markets for our goods as well, Laird Trieber. And he'll be, I think you'll enjoy him very much. And then we don't put it there. We will have a speaker on April 16th on China and Taiwan, but we will also have a separate treat. You'll see it advertised, of course. Mayor Johnson is going to join us, is supposed to join us, briefly at the top of that session. He has a strong internationalist outlook, so he wanted to come by and support the Council on World Affairs. And then we will have the presentation on China, U.S.-China relations, the future of Taiwan. And then on May 21st, a subject that, again, I know a lot of people are interested in, critical minerals, which really should be critical minerals and both the security and potential for our own economy. Because if you don't have that, then you will not have a prospering economy. So really good talks that we will be having later on after the summer break. We'll be dealing with U.S.-India relations. We'll be dealing with cybersecurity. We will be dealing, maybe an update on where Russia and Ukraine and NATO are. Again, I know we've heard about this before, but by then something else would have happened. I'm not all that optimistic about an agreement between Russia and Ukraine, mainly because of the approach of Mr. Putin, but we'll see what happens. Anyway, we are really privileged and fortunate today to have Dr. Jonathan Panikoff with us. He is the director of, those of you who remember, National Security Advisor and otherwise luminary Brent Scowcroft. Jonathan is the director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council, the largest, now I'm told, think tank in Washington. And it's a great think tank that works on all kinds of subjects, very much from a policy perspective. You know, what the U.S. should do, and even trying to help bring together other countries, quietly maybe, to solve some of the world's problems. So he heads the Middle East shop, and he also does some direction of a South Asia portfolio. He's a fellow in the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center, focused on foreign investment and national security issues. He is a longtime U.S. career intelligence officer. He's serving from 2015 to 2020 as Deputy National Intelligence Officer for the Near East and at the National Intelligence Council, what's known in Washington as the NIC. He wants to talk to you about one thing about, he watches closely the roles of, and competing roles often, of the United States, Russia, and China in the Middle East, including the Gulf. He will be offer his views on Iran and where we're going. We had a discussion at dinner, what's going to happen in Iran, and it was kind of like, well, what time is it? You know, it's unpredictable, but Jonathan will offer his views to all of us. I told him that we are not shy, the audience is not shy about asking questions, and he's up for anything. And if there are subjects that you he doesn't lead with, don't be bashful about raising them. He's just written an article about a subject that you probably don't know anything about. It's the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in the Gulf over what's going on in the Gulf and beyond, in Iran, Yemen, and in other places, and it's really a fascinating story. So, without any further ado, Dr. Jonathan Panikoff.
Can everybody hear me? Oh. You said pull it closer, but I think I should. Okay. I appreciate that. So I should start with a little bit of a caveat, which Larry stole a little of the thunder. By the end of the night, my speech may be completely obsolete, depending on what happens with Iran. So if that happens, please forgive me. Let me thank you all for being here. It is a privilege. Let me start by thanking Ambassador Silverman, the board of the Savannah Council on World Affairs, and all of you for being here with me tonight. And I actually appreciate that we slid this by a day so that it actually allowed me to be here. Otherwise, it wasn't going to happen. Is that better? Okay. Thanks. When I was putting this talk together, I went back and looked when Larry first contacted me about speaking here. It was June 26th of last year, 2 days after a very tenuous ceasefire took hold between Iran and Israel, 4 days after US strikes on Iran. I then sought to recollect all of the critical events in the region that had not yet happened and decided to ask ChatGPT for a list. Now, the initial list wasn't great. ChatGPT took my query, perhaps a bit too literally. And maybe, I'd even argue for those of us who have worked the Middle East for most of our careers, ChatGPT took the request in a perhaps existential manner. It told me, frankly, peace has not yet happened in the Middle East. That's correct. Peace has not yet happened in the Middle East. Quickly admitted user error, my fault. So a couple of efforts to refine my query, and here's some highlights from the list that it did give me. July 2025, Israeli airstrikes intensify against Iranian-linked targets in Syria. September 2025, the UN reimposes broad sanctions on Iran after diplomatic efforts collapse. January 2026, mass demonstrations expand across Iran, becoming the largest unrest since 1979. That's probably correct. It's not necessarily so. We can talk about that. Also January 2026, Donald Trump inaugurated President of the United States. February 2026, indirect US-Iran nuclear negotiations resume in Oman and Switzerland. The total list was decent, albeit with a couple of utterly glaring errors. First, I suppose President Trump being inaugurated last month, vice last year, can be categorized as either an AI hallucination or a dream, depending on your political preference. Second, there are obviously some additional glaring omissions. I'm not going to name them all here. But here's a key few ones ChatGPT failed to mention. The ceasefire between Israel and Hamas and the first phase of the deal being implemented. It didn't address the key developments since then, including the Board of Peace, whose inaugural meeting is back in DC tomorrow. And it failed to highlight, as Larry mentioned just a moment ago, the massive rupture between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates that burst into public consciousness at the end of December. And I'm hoping that we'll have a chance to chat more about these issues later in the evening, because I truly believe the region as a whole will be fundamental in shaping global affairs for decades to come. But my focus tonight is actually on Iran. And among the items I found most interesting not to be on the list were related to Iran. While ChatGPT mentioned the mass protests breaking out across the country, there was no mention of the thousands of deaths suffered by Iranians. No mention of the USS Abraham Lincoln and its strike group having been redeployed to the region, or, more recently, the sending of the USS Gerald Ford to the region as well. No explicit reference to Iran's nuclear program, ballistic missile program, network of regional proxies, a term I use loosely, frankly, because not all of them are the same. 8 months after being asked to come and speak to you about Iran, we've seen numerous starts and stops of diplomacy and continued war between Russia and Ukraine, witnessed the rendition of former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, and listened to repeated US threats to invade Greenland, a sentence I never thought I would utter. Over the same period, there have been critical, perhaps region-altering elections in Tanzania, Japan, and Bangladesh, and within the last 8 months, we have endured a head-spinning, pretzel-twisting explanation of the US decision to export some of the most advanced sensitive chips that we have to China. In the last 8 months, there has been a mass proliferation of the term 6-7, which I still don't understand, despite being ridiculed incessantly by my 8-year-old daughter and now my 5-year-old one as well. 8 months of undeniable world-changing events, and yet here we are once again, focused on Iran. Now, I'm a Middle East hand, former intelligence official, so I understand pretty well my inherent biases. It's easy to create a narrative in which we say your region is at the center of global politics and security and economics and energy. And so let me be clear, I don't view the Middle East as the only critical region, nor Iran as the only critical country that's part of it. It's not. But I would offer that every president since George W. Bush has said the US will be less involved in the Middle East, and it is no more true today than it was during his presidency. Like it or not, we cannot geographically isolate or wish away the Middle East. It is a critical link, both literally and metaphorically, to the broader world. In an era of intensifying competition between Washington and Beijing, between Europe and Russia, and even among middle powers, countries like India, the one region that consistently acts more than any other as a catalyst and a fault line for global affairs is the Middle East. A catalyst in large part due to the wealth of Gulf countries, their eagerness to diversify away from oil, a fault line, or fault lines, I really should say, reflected in the myriad of religious and ethnic and historic political divides that prompt crisis after crisis, conflict after conflict in the region. And at the center of so many of those dynamics is the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran is not simply another regional state. It is a country whose roots as Persia contain a history intertwined with the development of human civilization. A country with a population of a little over 90 million people and vast energy reserves and potential. It is a country that is deeply secular and deeply religious, ideological to a fault and rebellious to its core. It is both among the most sanctioned countries of the world and yet strategically unavoidable. It is diplomatically isolated, but until most recently, regionally in the Middle East, prolific in its malevolent behavior. Iran is a country of contradictions. And when great powers collide in the Middle East, Iran is almost always directly or tangentially part of the equation. So with your permission, I'd like to take a bit of time to explore two key questions here. Why Iran matters and will continue to shape global affairs, and how to contextualize the current situation we find ourselves within this framework. Why Iran matters. There are scholars, some excellent ones, who have dedicated the entirety of their careers to studying and trying to explain the importance of Iran. I'm not going to pretend to be able to do this topic justice in the next few minutes, but let me try to provide a very cursory framework, if I could, and I'll start by borrowing the title of Ian Morris's famed book about Britain, Geography is Destiny. Iran sits at the crossroads of the Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia. It borders the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most strategically important choke points in the world, and through which last year, 31% of all global seaborne crude oil passed. Or to put it another way, 13 million barrels of oil went through the straits every single day. Any disruption in the straits affects energy markets globally and potential supply from Europe to East Asia. Iran has some of the largest crude oil reserves in the world, and unlike some of the larger ones, Iran's oil is easier and cheaper to refine. Its southern ports connect directly to the Indian Ocean, giving landlocked Central Asian states access to global markets and positioning Iran as a key north-south and east-west trade corridor. But while Iran's geography could be key to economic global reintegration in a more positive, imagined future, global attention on the country today is focused on its ideology and capabilities rather than its orientation of tomorrow. Since the 1979 Islamic Revolution that resulted in the installation of Ayatollah Khomeini as the country's first supreme leader, Iran has defined itself not just as a nation state, but as the leader of a revolutionary movement. The Islamic Republic sees itself as a leading actor in resisting Western dominance, particularly that of the United States, and opposing the international liberal order that has traditionally, perhaps a little less nowadays, been not only backed, but led by Washington. This religious ideological dimension is not unique in the region, but Iranian leaders' ultimate determination to shape all of its policies through this prism has made it less compromising and more isolated than its neighbors. Despite what you may have heard on some news channels and podcasts, Iran and its government are not monolithic. There is significant debate and dissent within the government ministries and organizations. But whatever those debates, ultimate decision-making authority across every aspect of the country's domestic and foreign policies still lies in the hands of a single person, the supreme leader, 86-year-old Ayatollah Khomeini. And let me be clear what that means practically. If you take only one idea away from tonight about how to understand Iran, it should be this. Think of an airplane and the safety rules that you get at the beginning. When the flight attendant says to you, put on your own oxygen mask first before helping others. The overriding priority for the Iranian regime is singular: survival above all else. And that means Iran's willingness to help anyone else, even its own people, comes second. It's within this context that I'd urge you to consider Iran's uneven development that has limited its ability to project power through conventional military dominance and led, since the Iran-Iraq War ended in 1988, to Iran trying to project power in the Middle East in what I call a triad: ballistic missiles, a proxy network, and its nuclear program. Now, over the last year, Israel has significantly degraded elements of this triad, particularly Iran's proxy network, an aspect of its missile infrastructure, altering Tehran's traditional power projection model in ways that are still unfolding and that I'll discuss more in just a bit. But the degradation of this triad does not mean that it has ended. Iran's indigenous ballistic missile program is arguably the most near-term threat to US allies in the region, more so than its nuclear program, and that includes Israel, with most of its component parts being provided or procured from sources in China, North Korea, and Russia. The second leg, the asymmetric capabilities, as we call them, cyber capabilities, and terrorism. Iran has both its own terrorism program that has long existed across Latin America and Africa, but it's the network of what we call regional malign actors that it has built in the Middle East. Hezbollah in Lebanon, armed factions in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas in Gaza and the West Bank, which have traditionally enabled Iran to exert an influence far beyond its borders without direct conventional confrontation that it itself has to undertake. Now, the third leg, of course, is the nuclear program. I'm happy to do so in questions. I will not recount the history of the JCPOA or the maximum pressure campaign or President Biden's efforts to re-enter the JCPOA. But I want to highlight two broad points about the Iranian nuclear program that I think are important to understand in the lead up to our current situation. First, Iran has consistently insisted that it is being treated unfairly by the international community and what's called the International Atomic Energy Agency, which in layman's terms, as I'm sure many of you know, is the international organization responsible for monitoring nuclear programs and seeking to foster peaceful use of nuclear energy. Tehran often notes that it has declared its nuclear sites to the IAEA. What it doesn't emphasize is that most of those sites were revealed first by foreign intelligence agencies and only then declared after they were exposed. I was trying to come up with an analogy for this, and here's where I got to, and I can thank my children. It is the equivalent of catching my kids sneaking cookies. And I tell my wife and my kids, faced with Oreos or, I don't know, here in Savannah, Girl Scout cookie crumbs all over their faces and clothes, they sheepishly confess, because even for them, trying to deny it is not a great strategy. Now, I'll admit, the inverse doesn't quite work when I'm sneaking cookies and my kids are tattling on my wife. It rarely ends the same way. I tend to adopt what I'll call the Israeli position with its nuclear program, which is I don't admit it, I don't deny it, I'm just stoic silence. The second point is that Iran's nuclear program has an impact on the entirety of the region. Saudi Arabia long ago declared very explicitly that if Iran got a nuclear weapon, it would get one too. There's a division among analysts, and I'm part of this community, of how far that would then extend in the region to other states seeking a nuclear weapon. I'm among those who do not think it would end at Saudi Arabia. If Saudi Arabia began a quest for a nuclear weapon, I anticipate so too would Turkey, so too would the United Arab Emirates, so too would others. And this brings us back to the great power competition dynamics in the region as they relate to Iran. China and Russia both maintain relationships with Iran, but for different reasons. China has long sought calm and stability in the region. The idea of nuclear proliferation in the Middle East is for China anathema. Beijing prioritizes two things from the entirety of the region: the free flow of oil and a return on economic investment. I would encourage you to think of the China-Iran relationship less as a friendship and more as an owner-tenant. China simply wants Iran to pay the rent and oil, wants access to the building, and Iran not to set it on fire, and everything else, we're fine. That said, Houthi disruptions in the Red Sea and attacks on shipping have underscored how vulnerable global supply chains remain to regional instability. For China, which prizes its global investment footprint through what's called its Belt and Road Initiative, especially in Africa, instability in the region is a threat to economic growth at home in China, and therefore its ability to compete with the United States. As a result, Iran is critically important to Beijing, not because China views it as a great ally, but because Iran's regional engagements can portend the difference for China between freedom of navigation and investment boons, or increased costs and loss of access, even temporarily, to ventures in the Middle East and beyond. The decision by China in 2023 to come into ongoing negotiations last minute and finalize a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia was less about their détente for the two of them than about China's ability to potentially lessen tensions in the Middle East while also highlighting its role compared to the US in the region. China's narrative is a simple one. The US has spent years wreaking havoc and destruction across the Middle East. China is forging peace and stability. The relationship between Russia and Iran, on the other hand, is evolving even today. The best way to think about Russia and Iran are like the two kids who got kicked out of the same party. They didn't arrive together, but now they're standing in the driveway deciding whether to start their own. Moscow has traditionally seen Iran as a useful foil, which it could leverage during periods of increased hostilities, especially with the US. But the war between Russia and Ukraine, at least in Iran's eyes, has changed the nature of their ties and made the countries' relationship more symbiotic, with Iran providing significant support to Russia in its war against Ukraine, especially its early provision of drones. Now, Moscow probably would not agree with Iran's view of their relationship, and I asked friends and colleagues who are actually Russia experts to confirm this. But with Moscow and Iran both isolated and cut off, not only from so much of the global economic and banking systems, and both facing significant and ongoing military threats, the traditionally transactional alliance may be at a turning point. I would guess that I'm in the minority, but it's a growing minority, of analysts increasingly worried about a strengthening and evolving Russia and Iran relationship and its potential to move beyond the transactional to the strategic. Over time, this could mean everything from more advanced Russian air defenses for Iran, deeper economic cooperation, or even a scenario where Russian personnel are present on the ground at Iranian nuclear or ballistic missile sites, aiding Iran and raising the stakes for any future strike by Israel, by the US, by any country that would now be risking killing not only Iranians, but Russians as well. Neither Russia nor China have any interest in getting dragged into Iran's conflicts, but they're both determined to play a bigger role in the region for their own interests. Part 2. Knowing this, how do we contextualize the current situation? In light of understanding in Iran and Tehran's relationships with Beijing and Moscow, how should we think about the current situation and the role the US plays in the current dynamics? As you heard from my bio, I spent my career in the US intelligence community, including almost 5 years as the Deputy National Intelligence Officer for the Near East. This is a very fancy and unnecessary way of saying I spent about a half a decade on the 7th floor of the Central Intelligence Agency, authoring and reviewing the most strategic assessments that went to the president and the cabinet, congressional leaders, and others. I raise this because there's a prevailing and mistaken conception of what the US intelligence community does and doesn't do. A friend of mine still in the government put it best when he once remarked, the intelligence community makes judgments, not predictions. That is true of how we assess and think about foreign adversaries and allies, and it should be true of how we think about US motivations and President Trump's own policymaking. It would be difficult for anyone to say with confidence what the president will ultimately decide to do. I spend my days in Washington talking to a variety of colleagues, other experts, US and foreign government officials. And there are 3 things related to the current situation in Iran of which I'm confident. 1, it remains unclear what the administration's ultimate objective is. 2, without clear goals, there is not going to be a clear strategy. 3, this president is more willing than almost any of his predecessors to operate in that gray area without clear objective or clear strategy. 5 weeks ago, President Trump asserted to the Iranian people that help is on the way. So far, it has not come in the form they expected in hopes of bombs dropping from the sky that would take out the Iranian leadership. And in fact, getting information out of Iran is very hard. But almost every anecdotal story I hear from contacts directly, and more that I've heard secondhand, is that most Iranians right now are kind of horrified at the president negotiating with the regime at all. Now, the negotiations, I will tell you, and I do know this for a fact, are not going very well. The Iranian offers are in some aspects less than what it was offering to prevent the reimposition of what's called snapback sanctions at the UN last fall, very complex part of JCPOA, but they were offering the Europeans a slate of varying proposals. They're now offering, in some cases, less than that. That said, there's only 2 ways this situation with Iran resolves or evolves, through negotiation or through conflict. And if it is going to be through negotiations, then that harkens back to the issue of Iran's triad. Because right now, Iran has shown no willingness to give up or meaningfully discuss its support for regional proxies or ballistic missiles. And so the question is actually somewhat simple. Why wouldn't a regime, now quite weakened and humiliated, not voluntarily give up at least some of these tools to ensure its survival? And the answer is because the weakness in Iran, counterintuitively, doesn't make Iran more flexible. It makes it more defensive, more determined not to repeat the mistakes that it feels left it vulnerable originally. Now, to understand the Iranian mentality here, I actually need to bring us back a little further and briefly discuss Iranian-Israeli military engagements the last year and a half or so. This discussion tonight would look very different, for example, if I were holding it 18 to 20 months ago. At the time, Iran's power projection and presumed deterrence was at its pinnacle. Iran almost certainly did not direct Hamas's October 7th, 2023 terrorist attack against Israel, but it is culpable for it. Iran supplied the financing, the weapons, and part of the training to enable it. Back in the summer of 2024, which seems so long ago, Israel was less than a year into the war in Gaza, and its early prosecution of the war was muddled, both on the battlefield and in the public discourse. Hezbollah in Lebanon was riding high, having managed to stay intact by constantly lobbing mortars and rockets over the Israeli border, forcing many Israeli northern communities to evacuate, but not actually joining Hamas and opening a full front against Israel. The Yemeni-based Houthis were engaged in attacks directly on Israel and made life miserable for Western allies whose companies were trying to traverse goods along the Red Sea. And Iran had broken the proverbial glass ceiling on direct confrontation with Israel in April 2024 with the two-day skirmish between them. In other words, you need not be an expert on Iran or any of its broader network of proxies or partners to understand that from Tehran's perspective, it was winning. It had Israel isolated and surrounded, and there was little reason to believe that the circumstances would change so drastically that just a year and a half later, Iran's strategic position would be at its worst in decades. But here we are. Israel's killing of multiple senior Hezbollah commanders in the fall of 2024 in its pager operation, which for those who remember, Israel simultaneously exploded thousands of pagers used by Hezbollah members, and then did the same with walkie-talkies, shook the organization. Its killing then of Hezbollah's leader Hassan Nasrallah, followed 11 days later by the killing of his almost certain to-be successor, shocked Hezbollah and stunned Iran as it watched the crown jewel of its proxy network severely diminished, never having meaningfully fought Israel. Continued tactical battlefield successes in Gaza, setting aside for this conversation the very real and horrific humanitarian questions, and the killing of Hamas's leader Yahya Sinwar in October of 2024 crippled Hamas as a threat to Israel, which inversely meant a further diminishment of Iran's own power projection. And while the Houthis continued to resolutely be available to lob missiles at Israel, no group within the Iranian threat network is less likely to heed Iran's battlefield preferences than the Houthis, which have their own ideological drivers and goals that do not always match up with Iran's. By the time last summer's 12-day war between Israel and Iran occurred, Iran was already on its back foot. And while Iran, by the end of the war, had improved its targeting against Israel, Israel had proven Iran to be defensively hollow, all its years of rhetoric about destroying Israel if it dared ever touch Iranian soil notwithstanding. Understanding this is critical to understanding Iranian negotiating requirements now, and just how in conflict they are with President Trump's declarations, not only that Iran should have zero enrichment, but that questions over its ballistic missile program and support to terrorist entities should be on the table. In other words, Iran should have no part of the triad that from its perspective is fundamental to ensuring its own protection from and deterrence of Israel. For Iran, the last 20 months have not only been deeply embarrassing, but they have fundamentally shaken the country's security services and its military. And just as an aside, this started, by the way, within weeks after the death of Iran's president in a May 2024 helicopter crash. Here is the critical point. For the Iranian regime, the lesson of the last 20 months is not that it must compromise. It is that it must never again be this exposed that regime survival is at risk. And if that is the lesson Tehran has drawn, then asking it to dismantle its missile program, abandon its proxies, and its enrichment entirely is not asking for a concession, it's unilateral surrender in Iran's perspective. Now, ironically, It is asking this of Iran at a time when Israelis across the political spectrum have absorbed a very similar lesson to their Iranian counterparts following October 7th. Israel's view is that it must be more aggressive, more forward-leaning when dealing with potential threats, placing both Israel and Iran on parallel tracks for how they view their security, but juxtaposed to the direction almost the entire rest of the Middle East states are going. It is not just that Israel was so militarily superior to Iran. That was always known. It was the extent to how much Iran's security services had been penetrated by Israeli intelligence, giving it an advantage 5 times, 10 times maybe, what it would have had otherwise. Distrust is now rampant in the Iranian system. Disagreements inside the regime over the best pathway have almost certainly intensified. There appear to be a group of professional diplomats and military officials and intelligence officers in Iran who want Iran to provide some relief to the broader society and a bit of breathing room to the regime. That means for them cutting a deal with the United States. To them, that is how you ensure regime survival. There is a second group of hardliners who at the moment seem to have the upper hand, at least some of whom clearly believe another conflict with the US and Israel is actually in Iran's interest. It learned its lessons and will cause more damage to the Israeli homeland than it did last time, and no matter the US offer, Washington fundamentally cannot be trusted according to this bloc. Now, to many of you, that may sound like folly, it may sound even a little bit nuts. But remember what we said a little bit ago. Iran historically sees itself as a leading actor in resisting Western dominance, and regime survival matters above all. If your view within the Iranian system is that any US deal is ultimately going to compel you to be subservient to US preferences, then the regime is not surviving. It is morphing into something new and something different. So given how far apart the US and Iran are on negotiations, are they a farce? Probably not. There clearly are Iranians who want a deal. And consistently, over and over again, President Trump has demonstrated that he wants a deal on almost any issue. The potential desire for him to claim success and victory, regardless of whether the facts on the ground match the rhetoric he uses, may not matter as much. But I struggle to imagine how the contours of a deal would emerge that would be sufficient for both the US and Iran to have their respective minimum demands met by the other. That said, a deal, even a weak one, would likely satisfy China and Russia, both of whom want to reduce regional tensions, as we said. But it would almost certainly alarm European allies, who would worry about US credibility after Ukraine and fear further erosion of Western cohesion. If the result, however, is no deal and airstrikes are launched, the question, of course, is what comes next in Iran, the region, and what the superpowers with equities in the Middle East also do. Just this morning, the journalist Barak Ravid in the publication Axios had a piece highlighting not only the exceptionally large amount of military hardware in the region and being sent to the region by the US. So great is the buildup that I will tell you, me not being a military analyst myself, nevertheless recognize and agree with Ravid's central thesis that Trump is unlikely preparing for limited strikes, but rather for a large-scale, weeks-long campaign that could begin within days. The pathways of where this will end are too numerous to count. So instead of highlighting every possible scenario, let me instead offer 2 broad implications that will remain relevant for a longer period of time. First, neither protesters nor airstrikes alone are likely to end the Iranian regime's grip on power. Without a force on the ground, air power is generally insufficient. History suggests an end of the regime will require either some of Iran's security forces to stand aside as happened in the 1979 Iranian Revolution, or at least part of the security establishment to switch sides to the quite fractured opposition. Either of which it's possible to imagine airstrikes could help prompt, but such a result is far from guaranteed. The breadth of economic pain felt across the country in Iran, a water crisis which the country is suffering from, the regime's brutal reaction to the protesters, killing thousands, perhaps 10,000, perhaps more, makes this moment unique among the Iranian public's history of protests since the revolution. This time, something has fundamentally changed in Iran. And even if the regime does not collapse immediately, it's critical to remember that the 1979 revolution took a full year to unfold. This iteration of protests and strikes, should the president choose, should be viewed as the start of a new era. What that new era entails is unclear. Political transitions are not like software updates. You don't just reboot and suddenly have democracy 2.0. The end of the regime is less likely to foster democracy as it is to birth a military-controlled state that might offer a new supreme leader as a symbolic token to millions of conservative Iranians, but with power firmly vested in the hands of the elite revolutionary guards, the aspect of Iran's military dedicated to protecting the revolution. Such a result would provide three pathways forward. Iran could initially be a bigger regional and domestic threat than it is today, staking out even harder line stances as new and unknown leaders seek to consolidate power. Second, in seeking to quickly gain the support of the Iranian people by ridding Iran of crippling sanctions, it could demonstrate greater flexibility than the current regime has. So basically the complete opposite end. Third, we could see a period of confusion and jockeying for power in which regional states and global powers will have to decide for themselves how much to try to jump in to influence its direction. The other broad implication here that's worth noting, not striking Iran after such public promises of support does risk emboldening the Iranian regime further, which would be skeptical of the president's future threats and undermines US deterrence. As we think about the impact on Iran and on the regional and global geopolitical landscapes, a decision by President Trump not to strike would also reinforce the view of many Arab states in the region who are already dismissive of US reliability and the value of President Trump's word. At the same time, as we think about our great power competition landscape, not striking risks sending a message to Beijing and Moscow that US threats are negotiable, with implications for Taiwan, Ukraine, and even NATO's eastern flank. So what does this all mean? Well, the Middle East is going to continue to shape global affairs, whether we like it or not, and Iran sits at the crossroads of the conflict. How the US responds or fails to respond will impact the region, trade corridors, energy markets, traditional alliances, and the balance of power between the US, China, Russia, and maybe even India. The question before us is not whether the Middle East will shape global affairs. It will. The question is whether the United States and its partners will shape the events there or cede the ground to great power competitors, ensuring that events there will shape us. Unlike ChatGPT, there's no undo option in geopolitics. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. You've given everybody a lot to think of. Now I'll open it up for questions. Please raise your hand and wait till I come to you with the microphone. Thank you. Whoops, there you go.
Interesting analysis. What's your gut feeling about the competence of the current administration in dealing with Iran? We do not have a good track record. the last 40 years?
Sorry, so is the question how we should be dealing with it, or?
Yeah, what is your gut feeling about the current the competence of the current administration in dealing with Iran? Regardless of analysis, what's your gut feeling?
Yeah. Yeah, that is tougher than the one I wanted to answer. You know, I spend a lot of time on TV nowadays, and you learn to answer the question you want, not the question asked, but I will try to actually answer yours. Look, here's the reality. There are people in the Trump administration who are quite competent and quite thoughtful. It is also true that usually what happens in Washington is you have a series of policy meetings that start at kind of the mid-levels and go up to the senior levels. Think of it like a triangle. I used to sit in those for the intelligence community. I'd represent all of the agencies. None of that is happening anymore. And that means that you don't have a strategy. And if you don't have a strategy, then you're firing in the dark and ultimately hoping that the decision you make is going to end up with consequences that are net positive more than they are net negative. Does that mean that there isn't consideration being given? Does that mean there aren't people trying to influence? Does that mean that things aren't happening behind the scenes and they aren't thinking about it? No, I absolutely know for a fact the Trump administration and senior officials are working towards figuring out what options are and maybe what the ramifications for those options are, and the intelligence community is helping them. But sometimes the hardest thing in policymaking can be to not do something and to make a decision not to actually do something. And I'm not saying that's what should happen here. That's a completely different question. The problem is, I think there are people that are competent to do this. I don't think there's a process that's competent to match it.
Question over here, Jonathan.
Hello. How do you feel that Iran has done as a petrostate, and do you think that they have taken enough effort to diversify their economy, or are they kind of still fully reliant on petroleum and oil?
Yeah, no, they're completely reliant on petroleum and oil. Iran is so far behind because of sanctions that have hit them for so many years that they fundamentally can't get in even technology that we would have seen in the aughts or the early teens to be able to make the type of diversification efforts that you're talking about. And it's a real challenge because fundamentally the oil they're selling goes to China. And China's buying it at black market prices. And so it's actually aiding the Chinese, who are getting more energy reserves, which they need, at a cheaper price. It's very hard to stop. And there's been a lot of consideration about how you do that. There are ways that we haven't tried yet that we can try, but we're not quite there.
And our good friends, the Emiratis, buy a lot of Iranian oil as well, right?
They do, yeah.
You mentioned earlier the age of the Iranian supreme leader. Do you think that there should be an upper limit when it comes to political leadership? And how do you think that younger world leaders would affect the political landscape throughout the world, especially in the Middle East, in the future?
I wasn't expecting that one. Look, I think whether you want there to be an upper limit or not, trying to get the UN to do almost anything is really challenging. So I don't know who's going to enforce an upper limit. And especially in the Middle East, I think you've seen what happens when you don't have an upper limit. There's literally, the number of leaders in the Middle East who are octogenarians and beyond is astronomical. I mean, it's quite nuts. You just keep waiting and waiting and waiting and say, this can't go on. Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority and head of the PLO, literally is 90 years old, has diabetes, cancer, and still smokes 2 packs a day. I know, I saw him not that long ago. They do not pass on like the rest of us. In other parts of the world, I think, look, you're seeing generational change, and I think it's going to come whether we want it or not. I think you're seeing a lot of push here in this country, both on the right and on the left. I think it's going to have to be something that's taken. I don't think you can enforce or force an upper limit. I tend to think that's what elections are for people to make those choices. But I think it's coming at a much more rapid pace than we've ever seen before.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you.
I guess my question isn't necessarily, it's more about how do you, as a thinker, how am I going to put this? How do you, as a thinker, balance abstraction with specificity? Because when you talk, and I thought it was interesting, you used a couple analogies about there are two kids who got kicked out of the party, and the other one, and that was really helpful for me to kind of get from you what I think you were trying to say. So I guess my question is like, how do you're tackling some huge concepts, you know, like when you say Iran, like, well, what do you mean by that? And I don't like, not really like, what do you mean, but how do you communicate to yourself what that means? How do you contextualize these big ideas?
Yeah.
And how do you balance abstraction and detail?
Look, I can tell you what I do, but this is not going to be universal for everybody else. I learned a long time ago that I had to pivot. And actually being in the intelligence community was really helpful because you would be shocked at how much one member of the cabinet knows and how little one member of the White House staff knows. How much one congressman knows versus how much one congressman doesn't know. You spend a lot of time, you try to do as much research as you can, and you try to get those details. We have, in the US intelligence community, there's a whole profession dedicated to leadership analysis. And we talk about literally leaders, like how do leaders act, how do they think, on a very individual basis. We don't do that against ourselves, but it's the same type of thing. You want to know your audience going in, frankly. I think anything that's too abstract, I get bored with. I'm not an academic, I'm a practitioner. I think the more you can ground things in real examples and analogies tends to be the most helpful. It's just a question of not overdoing it and not treating your audience, frankly, as if they're stupid just because they don't have the same background you do.
Former Secretary of State Jim Baker, whom I had the privilege of working with, tells a story that he was summoned over to the White House on a particular issue, National Security Council, and he knew that every single member of the other member of the National Security Council and guests of the National Security Council had an opposite view of him. And this was the day that President George H.W. Bush was going to make the decision. So he was thinking, why do I even bother going over? And he did go over. And being James Baker and having a very close relationship, personal relationship with the president, 10 voices against, 1 voice for, president says, I go with Jim Baker. But he didn't, you know, he couldn't contextualize, he didn't know, he knew the others were against it, but he couldn't even think of arguments to use against the others. He said, what the heck, I'll just go over because I was asked by the president and I'll lose my argument and that'll be fine. So.
I'm curious as to whether you think some of the pause in a U.S. strike is the result of the depletion of the U.S. ABM arsenal.
I think it was part of it. I don't think it was the prime driver. My sense is the prime driver is that we didn't actually have the appropriate strike group and the assets in theater. Just fundamentally. There was a decision made, and this gets to a broader context. Right now in the US policy world, there's 3 main viewpoints that are all in conflict with each other in the Trump administration. There's traditional, what I'll call very broadly, hawks within the Republican Party, in the Trump White House, in the administration. There's a second group of what I would call MAGA isolationists that think we should be doing nothing anywhere except within the Western Hemisphere. And there's a third group that's smaller and right now is probably the most important, called what I've called the rebalancers, which are folks that think we should pull out of most places, but they don't want to isolate, they want to reshift all of their priorities to East Asia because the only thing that matters is China and the competition that the US is going to face against China for the coming years. The result of that was you saw the deployment of what was 2 aircraft carrier strike groups. One came into Washington for repairs, but one went to East Asia and went to the Pacific, and the Middle East had none for the first time in a very long time. Now it's come back. You've got the Ford coming. We'll see how long they stay. They can't stay in theater forever.
Jonathan, back on this side.
Yes, thank you for your time, sir. Your foreign affairs article last month talks about the united kind of jousting between the Saudis and the UAE. In your opinion, how do you think they're viewing this conflict? Because they are also kind of shaping kind of backdoor, especially when they're trying to get into more areas of thought like missile defenses and things like that. And are they essentially holding on to crossing their fingers and hoping the Revolutionary Guard just pulls a coup and just walks away from it?
Yeah, the second answer is easier. I'm almost certain that they are. That's an easier way to end this. Or, frankly, getting back to an earlier question, the easiest way is if the Supreme Leader on his own volition decides it's time to meet his maker. Short of that, my sense is there's a slight difference of views on how they want to approach this. The Emiratis have always been the most aggressive in viewing the threat from Iran, just as they're most aggressive in viewing the threat of what we'll call radical political Islam and the potential threats that it means for the broader region. I think the Emiratis don't want to be used. They have to publicly align and say, we don't want our territory used, we don't want our airspace used. I think that they're going to be much more flexible behind the scenes. The Saudis now have gotten to a far different place than they were. In the first Trump administration, you had what was called the maximum pressure campaign, and the Emiratis and the Saudis and the Bahrainis, the Egyptians were all united. And all of them were going after the Iranians. The Saudis have made a very clear decision that fundamentally did not produce the level of success that they needed for what their main driver is, which is the complete diversification of their economy away from oil. The Emiratis and Saudis are in different drivers now, and so they're going to be looking at this a little differently. I think the Saudis are very nervous about the potential for airspace to use and blowback, but I will note there's a little bit of a macabre bet going on among some of the think tankers about if the U.S. strikes, what will be struck in response. The U.S. doesn't have a significant amount of meaningful targets in Saudi Arabia. I mean, it just doesn't. You're looking actually more at Qatar again, which doesn't make as much sense in terms of Al Udeid Air Base. You're looking at Navcent in Bahrain. That's not to say there's none, right? Dhahran is a huge where Aramco is opportunity. There's multiple opportunities in the UAE. But depending on, the Iranians usually like to go parallel for parallel. If you strike military, they tend to want to strike military. If you strike a leadership target, they will too. It's worth noting the former head of Quds Force, which is the really elite operations of the Iranian Guards, was killed in January of 2020 in Iraq. People may remember this name now. The CENTCOM commander, Central Commander, Frank McKenzie, still has bodyguards to this day because he's still under threat for the Iranians trying to kill him.
Jonathan, but even if one American citizen is killed, won't it resonate way beyond?
Sure, 100%, of course. It's a good point.
Okay. We got 3 more questions coming up. Go ahead.
How would American strikes or action in Iran benefit the Iranian people or the regional stability? Or would you say our main focus is centered on benefiting ourselves and our allies' influence economically and politically within the region, regardless of the outcome?
I don't know. I'm not trying to be flippant, so let me unpack this a little bit. The problem is, if you have large strikes, the question actually that's more important to answer from where you started is, did they have the impact we wanted? Did the leadership die that we wanted? Did we actually destroy the nuclear sites? If we're destroying the nuclear sites, then is President Trump willing to admit that no, there still were nuclear sites left over? Because in June he said there were no more nuclear sites. We took care of that problem. Where did we go with ballistic missiles? Where did we go with the terrorism in terms of Quds Force leadership of the regional proxies? None of this, and it shouldn't be, is scripted. It's got to be a reflection of reality, and our reactions have to be a reflection of reality. I don't think that the U.S. has nearly as substantial benefit in Iran when it comes to, say, economic issues. On the other hand, Does the U.S. benefit? Do our European allies benefit? Does Israel, even the Gulf states who don't want strikes, benefit if this regime isn't there and a more liberal regime is placed? Almost certainly. But it gets back to the question that I had at the end. That's one pathway. The two others are mass confusion and competition. And perhaps the worst is that you actually have a regime that's harder line initially, more threatening. So there's a lot of problems. Anybody that tells you and says, no, this will be a good thing, absolutely, no doubt, run away very, very quickly.
On the side, Jonathan, back over here.
Yeah.
Can you talk about China again? If the oil is disrupted, China gets screwed big time. They get no oil.
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't they in these talks saying, can we calm down and let's work on this?
So not no oil. They get plenty. I mean, so the number one export for oil from Iran is China. The number one export for oil from Saudi Arabia is China. This happens across a lot of the region. It'll be a little more expensive for them. We've seen efforts to go after shipments of illicit Iranian oil to China before. And sometimes they've been interdicted and sometimes it's been successful. The fundamental problem is, without getting into a lot of details, I think you're having a China session at some point soon, right? So we'll let that person ask this question again. But you have what are called teapot refineries in China, these very, very small refineries. The Chinese have created a system basically that it's almost overnight pop-up, that if something gets seized, they can open another one and tear down what they had. It's like a whack-a-mole situation. You've got people, I, for instance, have advocated that we shouldn't be trying to go after the Chinese right now because it's not working. We've been trying for years on this. They're really good at this. We should be going after third-party nations. So the Malaysians, for instance, are allowing the Iranians to blend their oil off the coast of Malaysia before it goes to China to try to hide the original origin. It's easier to target the Malaysians. Now, folks, I don't know if you're having a South Asia person anytime soon, because or Southeast Asia, they'll kill me for this. Okay, great. Plenty of time. So it's a really complex web. It's not wrong what you're saying. It's really hard with the way that it works.
Over here.
Thank you. So does Iran have a strategy, or is it just purely tactical maneuvering to stay afloat?
Yeah.
And if they have a strategy, do we feel like we know what it is?
Yeah, so it did have a strategy for a long time. And its strategy, and I'm serious about this, it's called, what it translates to is strategic patience. In other words, Iran for years had said that it would take the incoming and attack and destroy at a time and place of its own choosing. That's been massively disrupted. All of the Israeli attacks I talked to against the proxy network, the attacks by the US against the nuclear sites of Fordo, Esfahan, Tans in June, the attacks by the ballistic missile program have completely disrupted that. So I'm skeptical the Iranians have a real strategy now either. It's why I think what you're starting to see in glimpses is significant infighting internally within Iran. The problem is I'm very skeptical the supreme leader is ever going to be as flexible as some of the more liberal negotiators would want him to be. Yes?
First of all, great speech. I really did enjoy it. I really wanted to ask you again about this artificial intelligence question and what sort of threats it poses to the Middle East. For example, like autonomous weapon systems and those.
Yeah. It depends where in the Middle East. So in some ways, if you're the United Arab Emirates and you've got 1.4 million people and you cannot meaningfully put together a really large army, you can only put together special forces, and by the way, they are good, very good. They are the best in the Gulf far and away. But no matter how many special forces you have, that can't overcome an army that's 6-7 times bigger if somebody else has the numbers. Some of what you're talking about in terms of the robotics, the long-term and the applied robotics, is where you're getting some of these countries looking. So for them, it's a boon. They see it as a huge opportunity. But there's this question on what we call fencing, on the chips that I mentioned very briefly, and where this goes. Because right now this competition between China and the US is a competition not so much over the chips themselves, but over what winning looks like, fundamentally. I think winning is no longer staying generations ahead. I don't think we can anymore. China's just throwing everything against the wall. I think winning has to be about convincing most of the world that US chips, US assets, US AI is better. And we're behind right now, and behind by a significant margin, and it has huge applications not just on the military side for applied robotics in the Middle East, but across almost every industry, in every sector in the world.
But Jonathan, again, to get to your point about this region continuing to matter whether we like it or not and factor in, part of our relationships with the Gulf are over artificial intelligence with the Saudis and the Emiratis and data centers and all of that, so they're going to try to play a role.
Absolutely.
Right. Other questions? Yep.
Jonathan, great talk. Great talk. How did the analysts, commentators, experts get it so wrong about, for example, Israel attacking Iran? If Israel attacked Iran, we were told that the oil wells would be bombed, there'd be widespread war in the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I can use some other examples in the Middle East also. How'd they get it so wrong?
I think there's two things to think through, and I'll be kind because I can't remember what I said, but I may have been one of those analysts.
One, it's very, very hard when you have literally no precedent to try to make an assessment of this type. It's not just wrong in terms of what widespread war would be, it's wrong fundamentally in terms of, I was among those. My biggest miscall, I've had a lot of good ones, but my biggest missed one was that oil would explode. The price of energy prices would explode. It would have mass disruption on oil markets. And the energy markets fundamentally just kind of shrugged. There was a slight spike early on. You saw another slight spike around June. You saw one in October of 2024 when you had the second skirmish. But fundamentally, the challenge ended up being that you just had something that had no precedent. The second thing, I think that is more important in when you talk about getting it wrong, I think we forget there's two ways to think about this, and I am not a theory guy. But there tends to be folks who believe fundamentally in systems, and there's tend to be folks that believe fundamentally in individuals. I tend to be on the very individual side. If you are a system person, everything has to operate fundamentally within a theoretical system. And if something goes outside of that theoretical system, like this, it causes an issue and it gets hard to explain. My view is the reason that looking at individuals and leadership matters more is because that's why some of this didn't spread. That's why things stayed contained. Because you had literally individuals from the Biden administration in 2024 and then the Trump administration in June running to the region and telling allies and adversaries alike, here are the limits, here's what's not okay, here's what we're going to do. And the US had enough deterrent to kind of push everybody back into their boxes. If you don't know that going in and you don't believe that going in, then it's easy to, I think, or easier to make a call because it doesn't fit your projected system model.
Well, I didn't say before that this is Jonathan's first visit to Savannah, and he enjoyed what little he got to see before, but we hope that he'll come back. But please thank him very, very much for all of that. Thank you again, and don't forget our next presentation on March 19th on Africa, and I'm glad to see the students here and students asking questions. I think we see our mission here as twofold: informing you, giving you the chance to ask your questions directly, and then also helping students who are interested in international affairs to keep building up that base of knowledge and interest. Thank you all very much. Good night.